As she talked about her recent cancer diagnosis, I tried to encourage her by sharing some of my own story. She asked me how I could speak so joyously and positively, knowing that I had a terminal disease. I shared my faith with her and told her that I know life on this present earth isn't all there is for me. Through my experience with cancer, I have come to realize that everyone is terminal. No one knows when their last day on earth will be. Every person, healthy or ill, can choose to see each day God has given us as a gift. They can choose to see each day God has given us as a gift. I know where I'm heading. I know God holds my future, and I trust God to prepare me for whatever comes. I think that's pretty powerful coming from somebody who's with terminal cancer.
I think so too.
Speaking of terminal cancer, how many of you know Russ Dietz?
I know he's in the church and we see his name occasionally.
He is not doing well at all. His tumor has doubled in size in his liver, and he is hallucinating and is not doing well at all. Phyllis.
Who's that?
Russ
Dietz.
Dietz. He goes to the early service, but he hasn't been lately. He broke his leg and was in the hospital, and then he was in rehab, and now he's at home, but he's not doing well, and the cancer is growing.
Yeah, I know Russ. The other sad news was that Dixie Peterson passing away.
Yeah.
Dixie and Don, I first met Don in men's Bible study 20 years ago when we were meeting over at in the landing. And since then, Don and Dixie have always had season seats at the UNCW basketball games right near where we are. So, I've gotten to know them very well, and it was very sad when I was shocked when I read the obituary. I recognized her picture and had no idea that she had passed. But
she used to play in the bell choir.
Yeah, she was in the choir. Yeah. Anyway.
Sweet lady, very sweet.
Yeah, her funeral was yesterday, evidently. So.
Daryl, this is Lois. Our volume's pretty awful when we've got it up to the max. Is there anything you can do at control so we can hear any better?
No, it's probably
Okay.
it's within your system or your speakers. You should have a volume control on your speakers.
We have it. We got it up to the max. It's our hearing, I think.
Yeah.
Over the hill.
So we'll be leaning over the computers.
Can you plug in your computer? Sometimes if it has more power, it helps the sound.
Do you hear me now?
We can hear Mel's the one that's kind of fading.
Yeah, Mel is too far back from her microphone.
Now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
A little better.
That's better. Thank you.
Yeah, and Beth, you've probably got speakers in the same unit as your camera because we're getting reverb, just a little bit of feedback from your mic when you talk.
Well, I can probably solve that by putting my headset on.
Yeah, with your headset on, we don't hear it. We don't get any feedback at all.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, let's pray for these people, and I've got their names down, and then we're going to start Sunday school, start our lesson. Dick, do you want to do it?
What's the meeting?
You want me to do what?
Pray.
I'll do it. Never mind, because I've imposed on you enough.
No, that's fine.
Okay, for these people that I cheated. I wrote their names down.
Well, you go ahead and pray. You've got the names all written down.
All right. Lord, hear our prayer for comfort and healing for Nancy Cates, Dave Moonahan's family. Again, for the boy that took some kind of pill that his body just shut down. God, the family and friends have to be devastated. For Russ Dietz, for Wendell Blanchard, and for the loved ones of Dixie Peterson, for those in the hospital alone, sick with COVID-19, their loved ones, for Felix Santiago. Lord, for those who are suffering and afraid, we ask your wonderful, comforting, healing touch. In Christ's name, amen.
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 In Philippians chapter 4, I wish I brought my Bible over here. Well, actually, I've got my Bible here. It says, talks about let your gentleness be known. Let's see. Anybody got their Bible right offhand?
I have one.
Okay.
Where are you?
Philippians chapter 4. The same one we've been working on, and it talks about gentleness.
Chapter 4, what verse?
I'm looking for it right quick. Rejoice and let your, does it?
Yeah, it's verse 4.
Okay. Would one of you read that for us?
I think Dolores has got it.
Okay.
You want
Got it,
Philippians 4:4?
Yes, ma'am.
It seems strange that a man in prison would be telling a church to rejoice. Wait a minute, I'm reading up here. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God.
All right, that's good. Read the one about gentleness again.
Read what?
Just the sentence about gentleness.
Number 5, Lois.
Let your gentleness be evident to all.
Okay, thank you.
The Lord is near.
What do you think gentleness is?
Soothing, calming.
Soothing, calming.
I think it's approachable too. Donna, our daughter, said recently that if she had a crisis, she wanted Edie Gleaves in the room because she just brings calmness to whatever setting she's in. And I think that's a good example of gentleness.
All right. Walt and Eunice disappeared.
Also, last week, our granddaughter sent a picture of our great-grandson, and she had him in her lap. He's 8 months old, and there was a storm, electrical storm, thunderstorm, and it was his first time to recognize the fact that there was something going on, that he felt scared or wondered what it was. But the look he gave her from that lap, and how calm Taylor was during that, that's what I pictured gentleness. You know, she was calm within the storm.
Okay. All right. Walt and Eunice, where are you?
I dropped out.
Do you think you have to be a soft-spoken, sweet person to be gentle?
It helps.
Yeah, I was going to say it helps.
It helps.
I don't have a problem with it.
If that's what gentleness is, completely, that leaves a lot of us out. I want to go back to your storm thing. And what Dick said, I think, there they are. Good, because I was wanting to talk to Eunice in particular. Can you hear me, Eunice? No.
I think you're muted, Walt.
Walt and Eunice.
No, I just unmuted him. There he goes.
Eunice?
Yes.
Eunice.
Yes, she said yes.
Okay. You used to be a nurse, right?
Yes.
So you were gentle with your patients.
For me?
You used to be a nurse, so you were gentle with your patients.
Absolutely.
Now that you look back on it, how did you act that we could say that was gentleness?
Well, when they rang their buzzer, you went in and you spent time listening to what the problem was. And if they needed meds and it was time for it, you were able to go out and dispense the meds. So that's caring and gentleness, I think.
I think gentleness, and I think about that opening story about when the daughter would do something bad, the father didn't explode. I think gentleness is what you said, a time of patience with the person, a
Absolutely.
time of quiet, a time of, and I'm taking what everybody said, because Dick said, and then you talked about a lady that just exuded bringing things into a sense of calm. I don't know that it has to be a meek, gentle person, because sometimes they can be annoying when everybody's upset, but they have the ability to kind of, like the grandmother did, bring a sense of calm to others. And I think maybe we're going to talk about what is it in them, because I think it has to be in them that they can give that to others. Does that make sense?
Yes. And you need to read Scott Loomy's obituary that's in today's paper, the 19-year-old. I know about 4 or 5 years ago, he came and mowed our grass, and Walt took lunch to them yesterday. And Walt introduced himself, and she said, "I know who you are." She said, "My son mowed your grass." And she said, he came back home and said, "Come with me, Mom. I want you to see if I did a good job." So, you know, he was just a gentle, the obituary tells how wonderful he was and what a loss he is.
Well, I read that obituary. That
I had forgotten that was the guy's name, but I did read it too.
yeah, my goodness, the things he did
Yes.
through 19 years only of life, it's amazing. What his travels and so on.
He worked with his father in Vietnam.
Yeah.
He and his wife, the wife was divorced, but he went over there, and the grandmother told us that he said he wanted to stay in North Carolina. He was with his father for a long time, apparently. Then he came back and said he wanted to stay in North Carolina. He loved North Carolina. So we're getting little bits and pieces about his life, but what a nice man he was.
Yeah, interesting obituary.
Yes, it was.
I think that, was it Ben Franklin that said count to 10 before you react or speak? Maybe that's a good way to exude gentleness. Too many times, if we react, we don't exude gentleness.
We exude, but not gentleness.
Yeah.
I think, Mel, I also, if I may be so bold, I think a lot of gentleness in one's character can be formed through the family life, their young life growing up in a family, particularly if it's a family where those sort of characteristics were observed. And I can tell you, one of the individuals I know rather well, who is very gentle with almost always, and that's my wife. And I can say the reason for that is, I believe, because of her mother. I have never known a more gentle, honest Christian lady in my life. I don't think she ever raised her voice. If she did, I certainly wasn't aware of it. And she probably did when I left the kitchen, but, you know, but.
Don't you bring that boy back here anymore.
Dick,
But, you know, Belinda reminds me so much of her mother.
Dick, Lois's dad was like that. All the years that he was still with us, I've never known him to raise his voice. He was the most kindest, thoughtfulest man I think I've ever met in my life.
Hmm. And look at Lois.
Oh, we've got Nancy on, people.
Hello, Miss Nancy.
Morning, everyone. Morning.
Something that Brene Brown says in her book that I think also fits in this. I think it's maybe a prerequisite to being gentle to others is to be gentle with yourself. Many times we strike out at others and are mean-spirited because we don't like ourselves very well. You know how we Methodists are always saying, love yourself? And I think that sometimes people that seem impatient and mean and quick to judge and quick to fly off the handle haven't come to peace with themselves.
I think that's true.
And so,
Look at the cat.
yeah.
You know, a person who comes to my mind again, who I'm sure he rarely ever raised his voice, was Bob Moffat.
Oh, yeah.
Such a gentle soul.
Yeah.
I agree.
I was thinking of Bing Crosby as Father O'Malley. Last time we discussed Paul's first prescription for anxiety, rejoice in the Lord always. Has anyone used that antidote this past week to control your anxiety?
Didn't need to.
Do it again. I'm not sure.
Actually,
What was Paul's prescription for controlling anxiety? I've forgotten what it was.
rejoicing in the Lord.
Oh,
And you know what? This one fits.
I've actually done that.
Oh, can you tell
I
us?
didn't know I was doing it, but I've actually done that.
Awesome. I understand. Well, I practice gentleness, believe it or not, with my neighbor who was really wanting to get into a political fight. And he was expressing views very, very contrary to mine about opening up versus social distancing. And so, and of course, my daughter being a scientist, you know, I'm especially into thinking about the behavior patterns of a virus. And so he started, his ideas about it's everybody's responsibility to look after himself. And really, it was like, so we don't worry about other people, it's their responsibility to look after themselves. And this is the land of the free. The government doesn't have the right to tell us that we have to social distance, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I knew he was just spoiling for a fight. And so after he finished what he thought, I told him, I said, I understand that you're coming from the point of view of you as an individual have rights. And I'm coming from the point of view of the behavior patterns of a virus. He's like, yeah. And I said, so that's what you think. And that's what I think. So there's probably nothing else to talk about. And you know, because why debate it back and forth, because he wasn't going to change. And I said, so we're really, yeah, that's different points of view. And I just kind of stopped it, you know, which was a little bit of a disappointment for him because I think he was not feeling well and he just wanted to fight. But I think that's gentleness, you know, when you just kind of step back and you don't engage. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
John 6:1-13 is our Bible study for today. Wait a minute, how did I skip the video? Guess the video's not up yet. Wait a minute.
The video's ready whenever you are.
Okay, it looks like John 6:1-13 comes first. And Dick, you're the man.
So this is where Jesus feeds the 5,000?
Yes, sir.
All right. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the foreshore of the Sea of Galilee, and that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where should we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Well, have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself.
Thank you. What is one thing that that stands out in your mind with this story?
I've always had a question about why they assumed it was their obligation to feed the crowd that had gathered around them.
Okay.
I think any hostess thinks that if somebody comes at the last minute, oh gosh, what am I going to feed?
Yeah, but if you're standing in the middle of a field talking to a crowd and a crowd gathers around, do you have an obligation to feed them?
And I often wondered why the little boy would bring food and nobody else would.
Well,
But
one of the things in one of our trips to Israel, one of the things that they pointed out is that the robes that you wear and stuff, you wear the belt around it, and the positioning of the belt then created a pouch, a pocket. And because you didn't have fast food places or any place to get food, that people always carried stuff with them. And of course, one of the viewpoints about that being a miracle is the fact that the little boy was willing to share, and he shamed the rest of the participants to also share their food. And so many people say that the miracle was that Jesus caused other people to share what food that they had, such that in sharing, and of course, that's the whole anyway, it's a different lecture, but it really points out the fact that if we back up, it really particularly applies to America, where we came to a land of abundance, and people who came to New York were coming from Europe where there was scarcity. If you deal in a society or in a culture where you think that there is plenty of abundance and you're free to share, then sharing then makes everybody get along, and it's much better for the entire society. And that's what maybe the real miracle is that people, instead of hoarding their food and their stuff, could, in actual fact, be willing to share what they have, and in so sharing, that's a real miracle. So,
Yeah.
That makes sense. It also makes sense with the rest of his teachings, which is loving and community. And then when we jump all the way over into the book of Acts, the early church sold everything they had and shared equally.
I had a similar conversation with one of my Korean students on Friday. She was
Her hair.
well, she was talking about, we were talking about the difference in the way our different governments have handled the coronavirus and how South Korea has been so successful in flattening the curve and all of that. And she said, one of my colleagues in the UK said it was because the Western cultures were used to obedience, and the Eastern cultures were used to obedience, and the Western cultures were not. And I said, well, think about it. You've got a 5,000-year history, and most of that time you had an emperor or a king or someone telling you what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And I said, this country was founded on rebellion, and our whole makeup is rebellion and protesting against authority and all of that. It's from the very beginnings of the United States.
Very good point.
So I think,
Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
no, I'm done.
I was just going to say, the thesis that Daryl presented makes sense, but maybe you could take the other approach as well, because Jesus asked Simon how was this going to happen, and he said to Philip, "Where are we going to do this?" But he was really testing Philip because he knew what he was going to do. He was going to perform a miracle. And if he could raise people from the dead, I have no doubt that he could take a loaf of bread and feed a lot of people. So I think there's a couple of ways you could possibly interpret this particular scripture.
And there could be more than one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus still tests us? I mean, he knows what we're going to do, but maybe we learn from the test. Do you think that you're ever tested and given an opportunity to learn about your faith from those tests?
I think we're tested every day.
Nancy, I think she's trying to speak, but we're not hearing her.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe that God, with his sense of humor, gives me the same lessons to learn over and over and over again. And if one wants to think of them as tests, I guess they are. I prefer to think of them as lessons I need to learn. And until I finally learn them, I'm just going to keep getting them. And they come in the form of, a trait of mine that rubs up against certain types of people the wrong way. And I will meet those people with different names time after time after time until I resolve that in myself. So I guess, yes, I think I am constantly being exposed to things that stand in the way of my being close to God or being close to my fellow human beings.
When we studied Lies That We Believe About God, or whatever the name of that book was by Hamilton, I don't think that God tests us because as far as some kind of cruel joke type thing. Remember when we studied that in that book, but I do think he tests us for us to learn from our own faith. So I agree with both of you. Yeah. What amazes me, my brother is, let's see, my brother's 3 years older than I. And we are just amazed how much we're learning. You know, it seems like you learn a whole lot in school and on the job. And then if you're fortunate enough to be able to retire and slow down a little bit, then you start learning about yourself, your fellow man, your world, your God. My brother and I joke all the time. You get old, you gain wisdom, and then you die. It's like, you know, I got wise now, and how am I going to use it? Unless you're going to use it in the afterlife. Anything else on that? But you know, the whole time that we were young, we were learning, we were gaining wisdom. We were learning. We just didn't know it because we were so busy. Daryl, we're ready for
Got the video ready.
Yes, sir. Let's go with it. So we need to all put this on one screen now. Oh, it does it for us?
Yeah, you should have it now. Okay. Can everybody see and hear?
Yes.
Good.
It had been a whirlwind, crazy day for Elliot. He had flown into town earlier that morning for a series of critical meetings with his team. And right from the start, it had been a race to stay on schedule. His flight was delayed. His ride to the city went to the wrong terminal. And as a final, irritating, anxious end to the mess, someone had pushed every floor button in the elevator. When he finally got off, it took all his strength to regain his composure and try to stay calm during the meeting. Well, that didn't last long. About a half hour in, one of the new members on his team made what he thought was a huge misstep. Elliot spent the next 2 minutes in an angry outburst, pointing out all the flaws in her plan. It almost brought her to tears. Elliot felt bad when he saw her reaction, but he told himself the outburst was no big deal. She'd get over it. Besides, the new member needed to be set straight on what was expected of her. The day finished with handshakes from everyone on the team. Now Elliot just needed to navigate through the hassles he knew would plague him on his trip back home. He flagged a taxi, got in, and took off for the airport. The driver was making good time when suddenly a car jumped out of a parking place right in front of them. Elliot saw the driver of the other car whip his head around and start swearing at them. The taxi driver just smiled and waved back and apologized. Elliot was livid. "Why are you apologizing?" he said. "It was his fault. He almost hit us." The taxi driver looked back at Elliot through the rearview mirror. "And there was a time when I would have let that driver have it," he said. "I deal with drivers like him every day, day after day. It's all a matter of how you choose to react." With that thought, he turned his eyes away from Elliot and, without another word, delivered him to the airport with plenty of time to spare. Each of us has been through days like Elliot had. These are the days when it feels like the world is against us, piling one stress on top of another. These are the days when it's tough to give a gentle response to anyone. But if we were really to examine our situation, I think few of us would argue that the Apostle Paul had it much worse. In his second letter to the Corinthians, He gives a brief rundown of just some of the trials he had endured in his ministry. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger from the city, in danger in the country, in danger at seas, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face the daily pressure for all the churches. That's quite a list. And any one of these events could have brought down a torrent of worry and anxiety in his life. Any one of these could have caused him to react in a less than gentle manner toward God or his fellow believers. The same is true with you. While you may never be shipwrecked, imprisoned for your faith, beaten, or put in danger from bandits, you have your own trials to face. You may spend a semester carrying a heavy class load. You may fight the headwinds of a recession. You may spend night after night at the bedside of an afflicted child or aging parent. Or, like Elliot, your trials could just be a series of unexpected events, things that didn't go the way you expected. But no matter whether those trials are big or small, justified or not, you have a choice as to how you perceive them. You also have a choice as to how you will react to them. The truth is that when these stressful times come, you'll be tempted to release angry outbursts, a rash of accusations, or fiery retaliation of hurtful words. Unchecked anxiety can unleash an Enola Gay of destruction that levels everything in its way. Just think about how many people have been wounded as a result of unbridled stress. But also think about how many disasters have been averted because one person, like the Apostle Paul, refused to buckle under the strain. It is this composure that he is summoning in the first triad of directives that he gives in Philippians 4:4-8. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything. The Greek word translated here as gentleness describes a temperament that is seasoned and mature. It envisions an attitude that is fitting to the occasion, level-headed and tempered. The gentle reaction is one of steadiness, even-handedness, and fairness. It looks humanely and reasonably at the facts of a case. Its opposite would be a sense of panic or overreaction. This gentleness, Paul says, is evident to all. Family members take note. Friends sense a difference. Co-workers benefit from it. When the storms of life are raging and the ship is breaking apart, the others on the boat may freak out, but the gentle person is sober-minded and clear-thinking. Like Paul, they look to God for the solution, and they remain contagiously calm. The contagiously calm person is the one who reminds the others that God is in control. This is the executive who tells the company, let's just all do our part, we'll be okay. This is the leader who sees the challenge, acknowledges it, and observes, now these are tough times, but we'll get through them. This is the one who stands up in the midst of chaos and says, let's take a moment to put this in perspective. God is in charge, and he will see us through. Now, where do we quarry this gem called gentleness? How can you and I keep our hand away from the trigger? How can we keep our heads when everyone else is losing theirs? We plumb the depths of the second phrase. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. The Lord is near. You're not alone. You may feel alone. You may think you're alone, but there is never a moment in which you face life without help. God is near. A friend of mine some years ago told me the story of how his 6-year-old daughter, in her hurry to dress for school, tied her shoelaces in a knot. So she plopped down at the base of the stairs in their house and focused her thoughts on the tangled mess. The school bus was coming, the minutes were ticking, the stress was mounting, but she gave no thought to the fact that her father was standing nearby, willing to help. My friend related that his daughter's hands began to shake and tears began to drop. Finally, in an expression of total frustration, she dropped her forehead to her knees and sobbed. Now that's a child-sized portrait of destructive worry, a knot fixation to the point of anger and exasperation, oblivious to the presence of the Father who stands nearby. My friend took it on himself to come to his daughter's aid, but why didn't she request her father's help to start with? Well, we can ask the same question in our own lives. When the stress rises and we find ourselves in situations over our head, why don't we call out to God? Why don't we realize that God is right there with us? We have to avoid the quicksand that bears the marker, God has left you. If we indulge this lie, our knotted problem will only be amplified by a sense of our loneliness. It's one thing to face a challenge, but to face it all alone? Isolation creates a downward spiral of fret. We have to choose instead to be the person who clutches the presence of God with both hands. It's interesting to note that Paul intended the words of verses 5 and 6 to be read in one fell swoop. The Lord is near, consequently be anxious for nothing. Early commentators saw this. John Chrysostom liked to phrase the verse this way: the Lord is at hand, have no anxiety. Theodoret of Cyrus translated the words, the Lord is near, have no worries. We can calmly take our concerns to God because He is as near as our next breath. This was the reassuring takeaway from the miracle of the bread and fish. Like the little girl with the knotted shoelaces, the disciples found themselves in a situation they couldn't fix. And just like the little girl, they were only one request away from the solution. Jesus had taken them on a retreat. His heart was heavy by the news of the murder of John the Baptist, so he told his disciples, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. But then came the hungry crowd. Droves of people followed them, a multitude of misery and sickness who brought nothing but needs. John's gospel tells us that Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. When John described the gathering as a great multitude, he was serious. There were 5,000 men plus women and children. Imagine a capacity crowd at a sports arena, and you've got the picture. Jesus treated the people with gentleness. He wanted to feed the entire crowd. The disciples, on the other hand, they wanted to get rid of everyone. And Matthew says that evening the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, it's already late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves. I detect some anxiety in their words. I sense a tone of aggravation and frustration. They are a bit testy. The followers typically prefaced their comments with the respectful, Lord, not this time. Instead, they march as a group to Christ and tell him what to do. The disciples see a valley full of hungry people. Growling stomachs will soon become scowling faces, and the disciples will have a riot on their hands. Now, they had every reason to feel unsettled. Did Jesus think they had the keys to Fort Knox? They didn't have resources for such a mob. Then again, did the disciples not have equal reason to feel at peace? You see, by this point in their experience with Jesus, they had seen him heal the sick, calm a violent sea, drive out evil spirits, even bring the dead back to life. Did any of them pause long enough to consider that since Jesus had done all these things, perhaps he could handle this pressing need? Did it occur to anyone that Jesus was near and they could simply ask him for help? The stunning answer is no. They acted as if Jesus wasn't even present. Rather than count on Christ, they had the audacity to tell the creator of the world that nothing could be done because there wasn't enough money. The disciples' disrespect didn't perturb Jesus or make him lose his composure. He didn't look at them in the eye and say, "Have you forgotten who I am?" Rather, Jesus just issued them an assignment. They don't need to go away, he said. You give them something to eat. Well, I'm imagining a few shoulder shrugs and rolled eyes at this point. The disciples huddle up and tally their supplies, which consist of a lunch basket a boy has offered to Andrew. Peter likely led the discussion with a bark. "Let's count the bread. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I count 5 loaves. Andrew, you check me on this." Peter then set aside the bread and inquired about the fish. Same routine, lower number. "Fish? Let me see. 1, 2, 3. Oh, change that. I counted 1 fish twice. Looks like the grand total of fish is 2. The aggregate was declared. We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. The descriptor "only" stands out, as if to say, our resources are hopelessly puny. There is nothing left but this wimpy lunch. Philip added a personal audit. 8 months' wages would not be enough bread for each one to have a bite. The exclamation point was an exasperation point. "Jesus, your assignment is too great." Now, how do you suppose Jesus felt about the basket inventory? Any chance he might have wanted them to include the rest of the possibilities? Do you think he was hoping someone might count to 8? Well, let's see. We have 5 loaves, 2 fish, and Jesus. The solution to the disciples' problem was standing right next to them, but they didn't go to him. They stopped their count at 7 and gave in to anxiety. John tells us what happened next. Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. And when they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over and let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Not 1 coin was spent. They had started the day with 200 coins. They ended the day with 200 coins. In addition, they filled 12 baskets with food, a souvenir for each disciple, perhaps. The people were fed, the bank account was untouched, and the disciples learned an important lesson. Anxiety was needless because Jesus was near. That is the same lesson for you and me today. Now, Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble." It's a promise. On one hand, you will have a problem. On the other, you'll have limited quantity of energy, patience, or time. And what you have is nowhere near what you need. You have a thimbleful, and you need bucket loads. Perhaps in these situations, your typical way of coping is to get anxious. You tell God to send the problem packing. "You've given me too much this time, Jesus." But what if, instead of starting with what you have, you start with what Jesus has? Before you open the ledger, open your heart. Before you count coins or count heads, you count the number of times Jesus has helped you face the impossible. And before you lash out in fear, look up in faith. Take a moment. Turn to your Father for help. Isn't this what Jesus meant when, after promising we would have troubles, he said, "But take heart, I have overcome the world." The world had certainly seemed to be against Elliot on that trying day. Even though he made it to the airport on time, sure enough, there was a weather delay on his flight home. As he sat in his seat, waiting for the hours to pass, he thought about what the taxi driver had said. He had been stressed, frustrated, and angry that entire day. And what had it gotten him? He had gained nothing through his anxiety. In fact, his angry outburst probably harmed any chance of shared trust with the newest member of his team. Elliot thought back to the days when he was just starting out. His boss at the time had been so supportive of him and had guided him back on course whenever he made a misstep. He felt a weight of guilt descend over him. Why had he been so hard on her? He looked around, but all he could see were other anxious, angry faces as they waited for a plane that was late. In that moment, he realized the taxi driver was right. I think you will find that this business of anxiety management is like pulling stumps out of the ground. Some of your worries have deep root systems, and some of your patterns of reacting to those worries are well ingrained. Extracting them will be hard work. In fact, it may be the toughest challenge of all, but you don't have to do it alone. Present the challenge to your Father and ask for help. Will He solve this issue? Yes, He will. Will He solve it immediately? Maybe. Or maybe part of the test is an advanced course in patience. This much is sure, contagious calm will happen to the degree that we turn to Him.
There is, we're going to start winding down the class because there's a lot left. So we're going to take up again next week on the same lesson. But before we close out, after watching the video, is there anything that you would say, after watching this video, I wonder, I question?
Mel, it was recently on the internet where archaeologists were excavating an ancient city, and they found a church, and in that church was a beautiful mosaic that depicted this miracle.
I thought the video was excellent. It was interesting how timely it is with these times we're going through. And he made reference to in these times. And so I looked back and thought, when did he write this? Well, it was 3 years ago. There is always stress and anxiety. It's been exacerbated with this for a lot of people. Don and I are the lucky ones. We're retired and not having to worry about losing a job or feeding little children. So all along, we have felt very blessed in our position.
I agree. Or go to a job where you feel like your life is at jeopardy because you have to go or you'll be fired.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
Imagine being a high school senior. You can't graduate and you probably can't find a job because everything is shut down.
Yeah, or college.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We'll talk further about this next week. I think it's a really good study and really we can all relate to it. It says here, a gentle person is level-headed and reacts to stress with steadiness and fairness. And I thought that's a good definition. And I agree with Belinda. There are some people that just have those soft, gentle voices that I was never gifted with, and I've always been jealous. But they have an extra, I think, advantage. And we'll be talking further about this, but I also, before we close out, was thinking along a practical line. I think that on a practical basis too, I think that our gentleness can be at risk when we're overtired. I get flat out mean and impatient and can't think straight when I'm tired, or when we're ill physically, or when we need to step back. Can you think of other physical things that can make us not the best we can be?
I think not necessarily ill, but if you suffer from chronic pain, you may not be physically sick, but you hurt all the time.
I agree with you, Beth.
Have you ever met anybody from New York City? I think living in the big city, you gotta have very sharp elbows. Because you're interacting with all kind of people every day, every minute. And if you don't have sharp elbows, they're gonna run over you. And some of the people I know and their personal friends who are from the big city are a pain in the rear, I'll tell you. They're so demanding.
Yeah, and I've almost got a motto that could be etched into my gravestone if I were not going to be cremated, that says, I would hate to live in a city. I just am not a city person. And to be surrounded by stress, to be just completely engulfed by it, in that kind of an atmosphere. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'd like to read the verse you asked me to read today.
Okay.
The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. I think that kind of goes along with our lesson to some degree today.
I think so too.
Yeah.
How many?
I'd like to ask Walt one thing. Had they already moved? The beach is not behind them anymore.
They're back from their tropical vacation.
I have other backgrounds I could put up there if I knew how.
This is his office, by the way.
Much better background because Eunice, you don't pop in and out.
I know.
That's right.
I was swinging
She's
from
not-
that phone, wasn't I?
She's not surfing.
I do want to ask Eunice a question. Eunice, have you gotten a date for your surgery?
No, I have not. I see my doctor Thursday for an annual physical, and I'm going to ask him, is there any way that we can, set this thing up and get it going? But,
Are you actually seeing the doctor? I've had 3 virtual doctor's appointments this month.
I have
Or
seen
in April.
PA at the Wilmington surgery. And, I gave him my history. He gave me a diet. And I have followed that diet. And luckily, I have not been in any pain. So I'm blessed. And I've lost about 10 pounds. So, because I'm not eating anything fat. And that's probably the best thing for me.
Did you get your tooth fixed, Beth?
I went to the dentist on Friday, a new dentist, and got stuck in their elevator. Luckily, it was the edge that had broken off my crown, and so they just filed it down, made it smooth.
My first husband that has been put on hold with his surgery, his heart thing, they're doing it May 13th.
So he's on schedule.
Yeah.
Really?
So
Mel,
yes.
where are they doing it?
He lives in Fort Lauderdale, so he told me the name of the hospital, but I forgot.
I just wondered what state, was open for
Fort Lauderdale,
non-critical surgery.
Well, just this morning on the news, it said New Hanover Regional is going to start some surgical procedures starting.
I heard that.
When is it starting?
They were opening up the, ability to do surgery starting tomorrow.
Good.
I guess I better call tomorrow and double check. But I called them twice and they just said we're not even making a list yet as to, when we can schedule the surgery. So I said, well, I'm going to stop badgering them because I go to the doctor on Thursday. And
Well, want to
Eunice?
Google WECT. If you Google
Eunice?
WECT from this morning, maybe you could read about what surgeries they were talking about.
Yes,
Eunice,
yes.
I think it would be worth the phone call because for probably 6 weeks, I have been on 2 surgeons' schedules, one at Duke and one here in Wilmington through Ortho Wilmington. And I'm number 6 on one, and I don't know what number I am on the other. So I am at least on a list when the surgery sites open. I'm on the list. So I think it's probably worth a phone call tomorrow.
I will call. And when I called, they said, are you vomiting? Are you having diarrhea? And I said, no, I'm not, but I have pain. And the pain didn't matter.
You should have said, I can, if it'll help.
I will
Hey,
call
Daryl.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
You had any prospects on your house?
Oh, about 320 some views online.
Man,
Yeah.
well, good luck.
Yeah. Well, we're in no hurry. We're still remodeling the other place, and so we're not in any rush.
You
My
staying
dog's
busy.
so old, all he can do is bark at stuff.
Where are you going, Daryl?
We bought the midget house, PD Midget's house, and over in Southport.
Yes.
Yeah, we closed on it a week ago. We had to wait till it went through probate, and then we got it on the 24th of April, and so we're redoing all the floors and painting the house, and we'll take it and put in a sunroom in the back, and do some things like that. It's in a location that Hope wants to be.
Well, he has a pier, doesn't he, to water?
Well, no, it's across the street,
Oh,
and actually, we don't want to be on the water because of the flood insurance and stuff.
mhm.
So we're exactly where we want to be in terms of elevation and whatnot. And this house here, we have four places. we only need, well, we need 2, one here and one in the mountains. So we have a place up in the mountains, and we want to build our own house on that lot in the mountains. So, yep.
You're going to enjoy PD's old house. I had dinner there with him several times when he was playing music. He used to go down Wednesday nights to hear music, and it's a beautiful neighborhood. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah, we know many of the people around there, and they're my Rotarian friends, and so we have 4 or 5 people within 2 or 3 lots. The Joe Pat Hayden, who is the mayor, his yard is in back of us. He's in back of us, and but yet we are out in the country. We don't have the taxes of Southport, and location-wise, it's where we want to be. And hopefully, this house has got. Right now, people seem to be hot, and with the interest rates being so low, we were convinced that now would be the time to make a move. And so we don't have any mortgage, and when we get finished with this house, we'll be able to build the next one up in the mountains and get what we want. So,
Well, you know that house has a tradition you have to carry on.
what's that?
PD always called Carol Mama, and she always called him Daddy at the dinner table.
Mel, we have to go. We have
Yeah.
to be somewhere. So
I had a wonderful time, and I'm going to take you up on them.
Yeah,
Okay.
do. You're
By all
welcome
means,
to.
you're welcome to.
You.
Okay.
God
you have a
bless.
good week. Thanks
Have
so
a good
much.
week, folks.
Bye. You guys have
Bye.
a great time. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Bye-bye.
Have a good week.
Give us a blessing and let's call it a morning.
She said that to you.
Oh, to me. Okay, here's a prayer comes from the will of God. That the Lord Jesus, bearer of men's burdens, comforter of the sorrowful, we would bring to thee all whose hearts are sad. Help us to mediate thy strengthening sympathy to others, but grant that we may be so continually refreshed by our companionship with thee that we may not be crushed by the world's burdens. Thou art the burden bearer, not we. Thou art the Redeemer, not we. Thou alone, O Christ, canst in thy strong heart carry the woes of the world. In this faith, teach us to do our duty day by day as we see it to be thy will, and save us from the depression of those who try to carry more than man was made to bear, and ever to look to thee, O Lamb of God, who bearest the sins of the world. Amen.
Amen.
Man.
And next